This is a course on the novel For the Life of Laetitia by Merle Hodge. The course is divided into 4 sections. This video, section 1, will summarize and analyze the plot of the entire novel, going chapter by chapter. This will therefore be the longest section of the course. In this section, we're just focusing on the plot of the story. In part 2, we'll take a deep dive into characters. In part 3, we'll look at themes, and in part 4, we'll look at some narrative devices used. The novel opens with the narrator, Laetitia, aka Lacey, enduring an uncomfortable car ride down Suklal Trace. A trace is a small, informal road, and Suklal Trace is Lacey's little home village through which this road runs. We notice from the first paragraph that Suklal Trace is a poor, rural settlement. Motorcars aren't regularly driven there, and we also see that people are taking water from roadside barrels to wash and bathe. The car that Lacey is in is noisy, and the movement must have been jerky as it moved over the rough road. But none of these is why the ride is so uncomfortable for her. She's uncomfortable because of who is driving her: her father. Her father's name, as we'll soon see, is Orville Cephas. Lacey is annoyed that her father is trying to make conversation with her, showing us that they are at least somewhat estranged. They clearly do not share a strong and happy relationship. Lacey has in the car a suitcase and a box of books, which points at 2 things. She's moving, hence the suitcase, and she loves reading, hence the box of books. Throughout the novel, we see how studious Lacey is and how serious she is about reading and learning. While Lacey is standoffish towards her father, we see that he's impressed with her for being so studious. He mentions that, unlike her, he did not get to attend secondary school. Lacey is the first in her family to attend secondary school, and for this reason, her father is beaming with pride. Early in chapter 2, though, we will see that Mr. Cephas has pretty much abandoned his daughter until now. So he shows up in her life just when she has become someone he can boast about. Mr. Cephas also mentions Lacey's brother, who we will learn is named Michael. He says that he tells Michael that he better not let his sister, a girl, outdo him. He says it jokingly, but later we will realize that this isn't just a joke. As the awkward car ride continues, Lacey's father drives past a woman named Miss Adeline, who is struggling down the road with bag and baby. Even though she puts out her hand to hitch a ride, Mr. Cephas drives right past her, showing how thoughtless he is. Meanwhile, Lacey feels bad for the poor woman, showing how sympathetic she is. Mr. Cephas then mentions to Lacey that her Tante Velma, which is his wife, also went to high school and is just waiting to measure her up for her uniform. This brightens Lacey's mood as she looks forward to finally attending secondary school and becoming one of those people she used to marvel at. We then get a flashback to when Lacey and her family had just found out that she had passed her common entrance exam and was now qualified to go to secondary school. This chapter provides more background on the relationship between Lacey and Mr. Cephas. It makes sense for Lacey to go and live with her father, as this would make getting to school much easier and cheaper. But we see that Ma is hesitant in allowing Mr. Cephas to take hold of his daughter. Interestingly, the father has to seek permission to take his own daughter home. This shows us that Ma is the one who is really in charge of Lacey, and Orville knows it. He has basically given up the rights to his daughter by being absent all these years. Mr. Cephas is grilled and drilled by Ma as he tries to figure out whether he is willing and able to take care of Lacey, and tries to get a clear picture of what the living situation will be like. Even after the interrogation, Ma does not give Orville an answer as to whether Lacey will move in with him or not, as she will first have to check with Lacey's mother. We'll learn more about her soon. In this chapter, we realize that Lacey lives with her grandmother, grandfather, uncles and cousins. The family is close-knit, and Lacey, even though her parents are absent, is well loved and protected. Ma, Pappy, who is Lacey's grandfather, and Uncle Leroy discuss Lacey's going to her father. We also see what Mama Patsy, Lacey's mother, has to say about the matter. She writes a letter from New York. She says, "It is high time that man do something for his child." Orville stepping up to the plate would give Mama Patsy, who has been supporting Lacey from abroad, a well-needed break. She expresses that her living and working conditions are dreadful and that she would never want Lacey to join her there. We see that like Mama Patsy seems wary of Orville, writing, Lacey can go live with her father and go to school if he and his wife will treat her good. But if they show any kind of bad face, she must pack her bundle and go straight back home. In this chapter, Ma takes Lacey to get her registered at school. She is in awe of how large and elaborate the campus is. One of the school staff, a haughty and contemptuous woman, talks down to Ma and sucks her teeth at her, embarrassing and angering Ma. This shocks Lacey. The staff member, Mrs. Lopez, who will later be called the circus horse by Ma and eventually by Lacey, also shows disdain toward Lacey and her family when she realizes that Lacey is the child of an unmarried couple. After visiting the school, Ma and Lacey visit Ma Zeline. Ma and Ma Zeline chat and laugh, using patois to exclude Lacey from the X-rated conversations. While Ma is a matriarch who has a large family to tend to, Ma Zeline, in Ma's words, has neither chick nor child nor regret to rankle her old age. Ma Zeline is an atypical woman, one who does not subscribe to the role of rearing children and serving a man. More on that when we get to the section on characters. At the end of the chapter, Ma Zeline gives Lacey a present for passing her common entrance, a book. This shows that Ma Zeline knows of Lacey's interest in reading and learning. We'll see through the coming chapters that Lacey is very much attached to her books. Orville is scheduled to pick up Lacey a week before school opens. On this day, Lacey gets up early and cleans up her little garden, which will be left in Uncle Leroy's care while she is away. Her cousins, Charlene, Ruth, and Kenwin help her out. Later, Uncle Leroy inspects Lacey's garden, fondly calling her the Minister of Agriculture. Though said in jest, this instills confidence and a sense of ambition in Lacey. Clearly, Uncle Leroy has faith in her. Uncle Leroy insists that Lacey carries something from her garden to her father. Lacey suggests carrying okra and bhaji, but Uncle Leroy says that bhaji is poor people food, and that high-class people does eat something named spinach. This jokingly highlights the divide between the lower and middle classes, and also between country people and town people. At the end of the chapter, it is reinforced that Lacey feels safe in the warm familiarity of Ma, Pa, her uncles and cousins. This contrasts with how she feels towards her father. And this contrast comes to life as the next chapter begins with the end of that long, uncomfortable car ride that opens the novel. The dreadful car ride finally comes to an end with Lacey reaching her father's house. There she meets Miss Velma Cephas, who Lacey describes as smiling and mournful at the same time. She's also said to seemingly be sick or sorrowing, even while having bright, curious eyes. We will soon understand that this mournfulness and sorrow is coming from how stifled and subdued she is in her relationship with Mr. Cephas. Miss Velma leads Lacey into her bedroom, which she will share with her brother, Michael. Michael's bed is a complete mess. Miss Velma, embarrassed and annoyed, tries to clear the mess quickly. There was some thoughtfulness put into Lacey's coming, as shelves await her books and hangers await her clothes. Lacey is hesitant to unpack her books, figuring that this little monster of a roommate will quickly destroy them. Lacey is immediately critical not just of Michael, but also of his parents, narrating that nobody living under the same roof as Ma could walk away and leave their bed in such a state. While not as well off as the Cephases, Ma ensures that her house is run with order and direction. We see that Lacey does not have many clothes to unpack. Ma did not allow her to bring anything old, faded, or torn. This again tells us that Lacey is not so well off. But more importantly, it shows us that Ma wants to keep face and present a good impression. Perhaps by sending Lacey only with her best clothing, she's showing that Lacey has been well taken care of. Ma does not want to give the Cephases any chances to criticize her efforts in caring for Lacey, or any excuses to not do their best to care for her. As Lacey has lunch and talks with Miss Velma, Michael bursts into the house with a commotion of noisy playing. After he moves right past his mother and sister, Miss Velma has to call him several times for him to come out and introduce himself. Clearly, this woman has little to no control over this boy. In the little time he spent introducing himself to Lacey, he doesn't show himself to be particularly bright or polite. Lacey determines that she will have to teach him some manners and get him under control. After all, she will have to share a room with this little rascal. On Sunday morning, Lacey goes to church with Miss Velma. When they return at noon, Miss Velma opens the front door carefully and tiptoes through the drawing room. Clearly, she does not want to disturb Mr. Cephas. Immediately, Miss Velma heads into the kitchen and make breakfast and lunch. She's listening to a small radio, but the volume on it is so low that she can barely hear anything. This is so as to not disturb Mr. Cephas. Just as the radio's volume is almost at zero, she has practically no voice in her own house and is living a quiet, timid life, always cowering in Orville's shadow. She then sets the big polished table for Mr. Cephas. This scene highlights Miss Velma's servitude toward her husband. Then another very telling thing happens. Mr. Cephas, before he eats, turns on his big radio and turns the volume all the way up. Miss Velma then turns off her little radio. This clearly shows that Mr. Cephas is the one whose voice will be heard, the one whose way will be had. Note also that no one is allowed to start eating lunch before Mr. Cephas, even when he doesn't arrive home until 3:15. Lacey sits in the drawing room, but she feels out of place in the forest of rich ornaments and the big television set. The place feels unhomely and unfamiliar. Mr. Cephas then brings his friends to the house and boasts about Lacey to them, who he calls the little scholar. Meanwhile, Michael comes home unnoticed through the back door. This juxtaposition of Mr. Cephas bragging about Lacey while Michael comes in through the back door unnoticed highlights that while he is proud of Lacey, he is ashamed of Michael, who is not doing well at school. Chapter 8 brings us a busy week. Miss Velma and Lacey go shopping for school supplies. Miss Velma also slinks away some extra money to buy material so Lacey can get some new dresses. Miss Velma also gives her a tour of La Puerta and shows her the way to school. Proud of how smart she looks in her new uniform, Lacey says, "I wish that Ma and Papi and Uncle Leroy and everybody at home could see me right away." This shows us that Lacey still sees Ma's house as being her home. She does not accept her father's house as her home, but is just staying there out of necessity. Next, we see that Lacey has now frightened Michael into submission. He's now afraid of her, and this keeps him in line. She softens up a little and begins to build a genuine relationship with him. She teaches him how to make his bed and forces him to bathe before lying down. But she balances out this strictness by reading him a story, which eventually becomes an activity that strengthens their bond over time. Chapter 9 brings us to Lacey's first day of secondary school. She's in Form 1H and is paired with Anjanee, a girl of Indian descent. This will be important later. The two should stick together for the week and help each other out, but they will end up being best friends for much longer than that. The two mesh immediately and are mutually excited to get to know each other. They sit together in the homeroom as their homeroom teacher, Miss Hafiz, introduces herself. After that, they get a school tour and muse after how elaborate and maze-like the school is. They even joke about getting lost. Anjanee, ashamed of her humble lunch, insists on eating outside, but Lacey wishes she could have Anjanee's roti and takari instead of the bland, soulless luncheon meat sandwich Miss Velma gave her. Anjanee's lunch looks and smells like the good, homemade food that Lacey misses. We learn that Anjanee lives in Orangefield, which is apparently far from school, making for an arduous commute. Lacey tells her friend that she is staying by her father, but expresses that she will not be spending the weekends there. Interestingly, both girls seem jealous of each other. Not only would they prefer to have each other's lunch, but while Anjanee would love to live in Balatier instead of having to make the long journey to and from school, Lacey would much rather make that long journey if it meant she could go back to Ma's house. The grass, it seems, looks to be greener on the other side. Anjanee comes to school late, looks tired and stressed, and has no geography textbook. She struggles to stay awake in class. Also, she has no PE uniform. Anjanee tells Lacey that she will be getting the rest of her books next week. But we will realize in the coming chapters that this situation with Anjanee only gets worse. Anyway, for now, Lacey and Anjanee eat lunch out on their log as usual and crack jokes about the teachers. Turns out that the circus horse, Mrs. Lopez, is their math teacher. The next day, in home ec class, Mrs. McAllister completely ignores the boys while constantly telling the girls to do this and do that. This is a reinforcement of traditional gender roles, where women are the ones who are responsible for working in the kitchen. Other teachers will reinforce this and other stereotypes as we get into later chapters. We will also see the division of gender roles very clearly in Mr. Cephas' house. Things are looking worse for Anjanee, who is not just late but absent from school on Thursday. We see how attached Lacey is to Anjanee, as she now feels lost without her friend by her side. In social studies class, the students learn about happy families versus broken homes. Children who do not live in a nuclear family with their own mother and father are in a broken home, according to the teacher, and such children are unhappy. Just as the home ec teacher reinforced traditional gender roles, the social studies teacher enforces a Europeanized image of the perfect family. In the classroom stands a picture of a white nuclear family, which is supposed to represent a happy home, happy family. Most other students in the classroom replicate this image and therefore this ideology by drawing the picture of this family in their books, which the teacher praises. So the students are being indoctrinated into belittling their own race and family structures and accepting the white nuclear family as the model to embrace and praise. Lacey, however, is not a sheep like the other students. Instead of mimicking the picture on this poster, she depicts her own family, proudly drawing Ma, Papi, Uncle Ira, Mama Patsy, and everybody else. She's proud of where she's from and the family structure that she grew up in. Lacey gets some pushback from the whitewashed, narrow-minded teacher, but instead of folding under the pressure, she recognizes the stupidity of the teacher. The strong sense of identity that Lacey has will be one of her main driving forces throughout the novel, and it will allow her to push through some very difficult circumstances. More on that when we look at themes later on, and much more on that when we get to the chapter on characters. We also get a glimpse into what goes on in Mr. Joseph's class. He's the English and Lit teacher. In contrast to the social studies teacher, he's responsive to and appreciative of the culture of his students and encourages them to focus on understanding and embracing their own stories, their own culture, before reading stories from other cultures. For example, he prioritizes Anansi stories over Greek mythology. It's now Friday, and Lacey is excited because she will get to go home for the weekend. She asks Anjanee why she was absent the day before, and she says she missed the bus. While going home for the weekend puts Lacey in a good mood, she notices that Anjanee is feeling down. Anjanee explains that she is not getting the support she needs to go to school. Her brothers and fathers say that she has enough schooling since she is already able to read, write, cook, and wash, and so there's no need to waste money sending her to secondary school. This is where we start to get into the downward spiral of Anjanee. Though she wants to get an education, she doesn't have the support she needs from her family. A girl has no need for education, as her job is to wash, cook, clean, and so on. This is the thought process of the men in Anjanee's family. Though Lacey is sympathetic toward her friend, she's happy to spend the weekend with Ma and the others. We see though that Ma is worried that Mr. Cephas might be abusing Lacey. She says, "He hit you? That man hit you? That man liked to hit. We know he liked to hit." Things are only getting worse for Anjanee. She still hasn't gotten her textbooks. We learn that she has only one school shirt, and she stays absent from school for 3 days straight. We see also that after going to her father and brothers for school money, she has been not just brushed off, but harshly threatened. Her father would rather have her stay home and help her mother with housework. According to her father, Anjanee knew all she needed to know as a girl. More education would give her too much empowerment as a woman and may allow her to overstep her bounds. Anjanee's household represents, at the extreme, this idea that the role of a woman is confined to homemaking and that education is not meant for women. After all, how much education do you need to wash clothes and clean a house? More on this when we get to themes. Anjanee suffers a fever and a headache after walking in the sun selling vegetables, trying to fund her own schooling. What motivates Anjanee so strongly is seeing her mother's situation. Her mother is stuck working at home like a slave. Anjanee's mother works hard, even from before the sun rises, only to be completely unappreciated by the men in the house. Anjanee says, "I'm not going to end up like my mother. I'd rather dead." This is a grim instance of foreshadowing. We'll get to that much later on. Anjanee knows that securing proper education is the only way to ensure that she does not end up like her mother, and she's willing to do whatever it takes to make it through school, regardless of the pushback from the men in the house. Michael and Lacey are now getting along quite well. Not only that, but he has been whipped into shape by his big sister, and now does a pretty good job keeping his side of the room clean. How Michael responds to Lacey contrasts with how he responds to his mother. While he respects and obeys Lacey, he disregards his mother, who regularly begs him to do his homework, eat, bathe, and come home early. We see though that unlike Mr. Velma, Mr. Cephas has a handle on him. From time to time, Mr. Cephas has reading lessons with his son, but instead of patiently teaching Michael how to read, he threatens and abuses him, sometimes shouting at him, other times calling him worthless, and other times beating him with a belt or even with a book. Mr. Cephas' domineering rage extends to his wife as well, as he shakes his belt at her threateningly when she pleads for Michael. It seems that Mr. Cephas is quite capable of beating Miss Velma with this very belt. Mr. Cephas also takes interest in Lacey's schoolwork. While he's frustrated with Michael, he's quite pleased with how well Lacey is doing. We see in the last few paragraphs that Miss Velma lives in constant fear and anxiety, always fretting that she might face the wrath of Mr. Cephas. She creeps around the house meekly and speaks in a low, apologizing voice. When Mr. Cephas is not home, Miss Velma is like a dog waiting for its owner. Miss Velma might be comparable to Anjanee's mother in how they are mistreated and taken advantage of by their husbands. The last paragraph of the chapter goes into why Mr. Cephas chose to marry Miss Velma. It is because, according to him, marrying someone white or whitish indicates that one is moving up in the world. On that basis, he married the red-skinned woman, Miss Velma. Lacey continues to enjoy spending weekends back home with Ma and the others, but the time passes too quickly. She gets a letter from her mother. Mama Patsy wants to know if Lacey is still comfortable in her father's house. Just like Mama Patsy seems to be waiting for something bad to happen. Anyway, we learn that since Mr. Cephas is now playing a more active role in Lacey's life, at least financially, and now that the government is giving her her secondary education, Mama Patsy is now able to finally focus on her own schooling. She has enrolled into night classes in an effort to get her high school diploma. Juggling night classes with the long working hours is extremely tough, but Mama Patsy seems motivated to give it her best shot. Lacey's form class, H1, are now testing the limits and pushing the boundaries when it comes to school rules. This is especially so for a particular group led by the feared deviant Doreen Sandiford, a posse that regularly commits the most forbidden of crimes, which is visiting the La Puerta shopping plaza not only in their uniforms, but also during school hours. Another ringleader in the class is Marlon Peters. He leads a gang of troublesome boys. However, we see that even the most daring of students are quite selective with whose classes they mess around in. No one disrupts Miss Hafiz's class, or the circus horses class. Mr. Joseph again proves to be a teacher who can capture the students' attention with the power of stories. Even Marlon Peters and his gang pay attention. Seeing themselves in these stories gives the students a sense of pride and validation. In contrast, Mrs. Lopez crushes the students' sense of pride by talking down to them and disregarding their thoughts and questions. We see where she pompously snaps at Anjanee when she asks for a clarification on a math problem. Lacey bravely stands up to Mrs. Lopez, however. The circus horse's subsequent threat to send Lacey to the principal's office turns out to be a bluff, as she instead resorts to insulting and humiliating the students. Mrs. Lopez's slew of insults hurt and anger the students. They boil and fume amongst themselves and express a need to get back at her. This leads to a run-in with Mr. Tewari, the usually meek Spanish teacher. After that scuffle ends, Marlon Peters and some other boys cause some more trouble in Mr. Tewari's class. The teacher angrily sends out Marlon and some of the other boys, but as usual, lets the Indian boys off the hook, even though they're just as troublesome. In jest, Marlon sings a song that actually reveals ideas about a deep-rooted racism in the society. This lines up well with Mr. Tewari's habit of blaming the black boys for all the trouble, while being lenient toward the boys of Indian descent. The funny little song ends with the lines, "Nigger is a nation, damn botheration. Give them a kick and send them in the station." The song reinforces the idea of black people being menaces to society and also being inferior to their Indian counterparts. A racial complex that is woven into Trinidadian culture even to this day. More on this when we get to themes. This chapter shows us how Lacey has transformed Michael. He now cleans up after himself and takes genuine interest in reading. Just as Mr. Joseph uses stories to empower his students, Lacey, through stories, has inculcated in the boy a love for reading. One day, while Lacey is teaching him to wash dishes, Mr. Cephas shows up and makes a big ruckus over the idea of his son washing dishes. He shouts and curses at his wife for allowing such a thing. Listen to these lines from Mr. Cephas. "I tired talk to you about how you turning this boy into a damn kunumunu. No wonder he can't learn his book. 2 female in the house and my son have to be washing wares. Boy, get your tail from down there. And if your mother put you to wash wares again, tell her go to hell." Such a blatant display of sexism and reinforcement of traditional gender roles. Also note how Mr. Cephas enables his son to disrespect his mother. He says, "And if your mother put you to wash wares again, tell her go to hell. This means Mr. Cephas' behavior will likely be replicated by his son. Mr. Cephas twice raises his hand as if to hit Miss Velma, asserting physical dominance over his wife, showing that he is capable of hitting her too. He might have done so in the past. Even scarier is the fact that this warning, this threatening outburst belched out at Miss Velma, is actually aimed indirectly at Lacey. Mr. Cephas knows that Lacey must have been the one to put Michael up to washing dishes. After this fiasco, Mr. Cephas, as is routine, abuses Michael under the guise of a reading lesson, beating him not just with belt and book, but also with slipper and walking stick. After this, Miss Velma shows Lacey an old photo album in which a young Miss Velma looks bright and cheery, even in her wedding pictures with Mr. Cephas. Miss Velma reflects on when she too went to secondary school, but her funding for education was cut in order to send her brother to school. She says it's more important for a boy to get education. After dropping out of school, she took up a sewing job, but then even that she had to leave behind upon marrying Mr. Cephas. In earlier line, Miss Velma says in reference to men, "Jump high or jump low, you have to please them. That is a woman's lot." We see that Miss Velma fully accepts her fate as servant, even as slave to her husband. All her life, she has had to take a backseat to men. First, it was her brother who was given priority over her, and then it was Mr. Cephas who took away what little independence she had by ensuring that she left her sewing job, and who now dominates and overshadows her completely. The chapter ends with a desperate yet understated warning from Miss Velma to Lacey, as Lacey is about to help her with house chores. "That is my work. Take your book and study a lesson, and study it good." Miss Velma accepts that she has no hope of escaping the tyranny of her husband, but is hopeful that by getting an education, Lacey's future might be different. This chapter makes it all too clear that in Mr. Cephas' house, and in the society outside, men dominate while women meekly serve them quietly from the shadows. To this end, education is kept away from women so as to keep them down, so as to prevent them from reaching a state of empowerment and independence, as this would disrupt the social structures of misogyny and female objectification. More on this when we get to themes. Everyone in the class feels sorry for Anjanee and does their best to help where they can by sharing their textbooks with her, helping her with answering questions, running to her aid when she feels unwell during PE, and so on. The students, as they rally around Anjanee, build up resentment for the circus horse, who continually picks on her and makes life even harder for her. Amidst the hardship and ill treatment, Anjanee does her very best to make the most of her time at school. But the circus horse works overtime to crush the girl's spirit, writing messages like "hopeless" and "you will never learn" in her books. Just as Lacey is determined not to end up like Miss Velma, Anjanee, even more so, is determined not to end up like her mother. However, between the lack of support from those at home and the constant attacks and discouragement from the circus horse, Anjanee ends up missing almost a full week in a row from school. When the circus horse notices Anjanee's extended absence, she comments, "That is one less dance, one less headache for me. Praise God." This angers Lacey to the point where she can no longer ignore the insults. She makes a loud noise to get Mrs. Lopez's attention, looking her dead in the eye. But what follows, not even Lacey had expected. The entire class, inspired by Lacey's action, rebels against the circus horse by pushing their math instruments off their desks. The class's protest trigger Mrs. Lopez to threaten to call the principal. But again, as has been the case many times, this turns out to be an empty threat. The class has gotten used to calling Mrs. Lopez's bluffs, and with this unified act of protest, they have somewhat broken loose from her tyranny. Lacey's class becomes increasingly brazen. Not only are they acting up in Mrs. Lopez's class, but in other teachers' classes as well. Mr. Tewari, after several scuffles with them, reports them to their homeroom teacher. In Miss Hafiz's address to the class, racism comes up. The class complains that Mr. Tewari is harsh on the black students, but goes easy on the Indians. In the middle of this conversation, Marlon Peters says, "My father said the only good coolie is a dead coolie." The class laughs. But such statements underline the racial tension and separation in their society. Then Marlon Peters repeats what one of his coolie classmates said. "Miss Prasad said he uncle tell him he want to go in South Africa and help them white people kill out nigger." The students make fun of all this, but Mrs. Hafiz is struck with horror. "Lord have mercy," she exclaims. When the students see how stricken Miss Hafiz is, they sober themselves and quiet down. Then there's an interesting conversation where the students, who had called Mr. Tewari racial rather than racist, differentiate between the two descriptors. To them, the word racist belongs to a foreign phenomenon, one that exists in America or South Africa, and which involves parties like the Ku Klux Klan, while the word racial describes the more familiar prejudices that they see and experience day to day. Miss Hafiz quickly clears up this nonsense, telling them that what happens right there in this classroom, right there in their communities, right there in Trinidad, is racism, and it is dangerous. Miss Hafiz teaches them that racism is no laughing matter, and that regardless of race, we need each other and are a part of each other. After having gotten used to spending weekends back at Ma and the others, Lacey now learns that her father will not be sending her home this weekend. Lacey immediately schemes out ways in which she could go home for the weekend behind her father's back. As Ma Zeline comes up in Lacey's mind, her character is developed a bit more. Lacey recalls Ma saying, "But who said just because you name woman, you must mind child?" Not Zeline. Zeline, we see, is an independent, free-thinking woman who also has a fighting spirit within her. She is ahead of her time and has the respect of both Lacey and Ma. By the time Lacey gets to talking about having to stay at her father's house for the weekend with her friend Anjanee, she's less stressed about the matter and decides that if she uses the chance to visit Ma Zeline, things wouldn't be so bad. But Lacey's problem is insignificant compared to Anjanee's. Test time is coming up and Anjanee, because of being absent so often, is far too behind to catch up. Lacey promises to help her study. It is still Friday. When Lacey hears a car outside, she hopes that Ma is so distrustful of Mr. Cephas that she has sent Uncle Leroy to pick her up. However, it was Mr. Cephas himself, home earlier than usual. Perhaps he is home extra early this Friday to spend time with Lacey, who will be spending the weekend there with him. The two exchange greetings awkwardly. Michael appears and as usual his father shouts at him. Instead of going out, as he apparently usually does, Mr. Cephas stays home. He eats, cleans his car, and then sits in the drawing room reading a newspaper. Lacey feels like he is home early just to make sure she doesn't try to escape. We see that Mr. Cephas, big and bad as he is, seems nervous and uncertain around Lacey, itching to start a conversation with her, but not quite sure how to approach. The next morning is more of the same. Mr. Cephas shouts at Michael and clumsily interacts with Lacey. After spending a long time readying and eating, he leaves, giving Lacey her chance to go and visit Ma Zeline. Lacey visits Ma Zeline, who half-jokingly expresses that she should have come by long before now. They joke around and catch up with each other. But the mood changes when they start talking about Anjanee. Hearing of Anjanee's plight, Ma Zeline says that poor little girl will do something one day. And then all of them will hold their head and bawl. Ma Zeline thinks that Anjanee might commit suicide, and this comment of hers serves as a dark foreshadowing. More on that when we get to the vices. Then Ma Zeline turns her attention to Lacey's father. "So what about Mr. Cephas now, that old nastiness?" she says. It seems that everyone has a negative impression of Mr. Cephas and is just waiting on him to show his true colors. Ma Zeline asks, "He treating you properly or he take you make servant?" Clearly she knows about how domineering and sexist Mr. Cephas is. The question opens the floodgates for Lacey to vent to Ma Zeline about the terrible time she has been having at Mr. Cephas's house. Again, we see that education is understood as a means of liberation from men. As Ma Zeline says, "You just study a book and one day you will have your own money. You will never have to ask a man for nothing." Lacey promises to visit Ma Zeline whenever her father keeps her for the weekend. After that, the two roam the garden and forage for food and continue chatting about various things. Monday morning brings with it the beginning of the midterm tests. We see that even on the Spanish paper, the traditional gender roles are pushed, with questions about mommy in the supermarket, daddy in his office. Anjanee gets to school late, fretting about the tests, so sick with fried cheese that she bends over vomiting just before the math exam. Lacey wants to help Anjanee in the tests, but under the hawk eyes of the circus horse, cheating in the exam is off the table. Time quickly comes for them to get their test results. As usual, the circus horse insults and demeans Anjanee, as well as other students. She humiliates Anjanee in front of everyone, asking why she doesn't stay home and help them make garden. School is not for the brainless imbeciles like Anjanee, it seems. Anjanee and many others fail, but Laetitia Johnson is top of the class with an impressive 98%. After class, Mrs. Lopez meets with Lacey and implies that she should cut ties with Anjanee, who will otherwise drag her down. But Lacey, as we know, has no plans to betray or abandon her friend. Finally, Mr. Cephas changes gears on Lacey, giving her a bit of the roughing up that he dishes out to the rest of his family. When Lacey tells him good evening, he responds, "Good evening who?" Your grandmother teach you to disrespect me, eh? Lacey tells him, "Good evening, sir." But Mr. Cephas expresses that he should instead be called father. It seems he wants to have Lacey's respect and affection, but he has no intention, it seems, of doing the work to build their relationship. He prods at Lacey, trying to find a problem to argue about. He gets his chance when he realizes that she's in the bedroom reading a storybook. He says to her, caustically, "You're lying down in a bed reading storybook and Miss Velma in the kitchen with all the work. You're going to be a worthless woman?" Of course, a woman who does not spend her life doing housework is worthless. Obviously, sending Lacey to school is just a matter of status and ego for Mr. Cephas, as instead of looking forward to his daughter having a liberated life through education, he pushes the same old narrative that a woman's worth and purpose is in housekeeping and serving men. He goes on to make it clear to Lacey that she needs to start helping out more around the house. She needs to pull her weight, earn her keep. He also insinuates that she will no longer be going back home to Ma on the weekends, at least not frequently. This is the harshest conversation we've seen him have with Lacey so far. But as you know, it only gets worse. Lacey is again stuck at home for the weekend. To make matters worse, Mr. Cephas lingers at home, shouting at Michael while trying to make conversation with Lacey. He praises Lacey for the neatness of the drawing room, while bashing Michael for not learning anything. Mr. Cephas asks Lacey when she will be getting her exam results. He just wants to boast to his peers about how well his daughter is doing in school. In response, Lacey fails her math homework to spite her father. This also drives the circus horse into despair, making for a double win. Much worse off is Anjanee, who not only failed almost every test, but is constantly exhausted and sad, and also suffers constant headaches. It has gotten so bad that she's even considering quitting school. "I'm only wasting taxi fare to come here. Better I stay home and help my mother. I'm not learning nothing," she says. After Lacey reprimands her for harboring such thoughts, Anjanee says that she's too far behind and couldn't possibly afford extra lessons. This gives Lacey the bright idea to start tutoring Anjanee after school. Staying out late would also double as a way to defy her father and, in a sense, rebel against him. This plan is quickly implemented, much to the weariness and anxiousness of Miss Velma. If he ever finds out, it would be big trouble for Lacey and her. For Lacey, the risk is worth it though, as Anjanee's schoolwork improves bit by bit. She even rises to 6 out of 10 marks in geography. Lacey is held hostage at the Cephas' for another weekend. She writes to Ma, who tells her to stay put until the Christmas holidays, which is a few weeks from now. Ma, in her letter to Lacey, also encloses some emergency bus fare to spite her father and to give him reasons to send her back to Ma. Lacey starts getting into trouble at school, even being reported to Miss Hafiz by multiple teachers. Miss Hafiz tells Lacey that if she's reported again, her parents will be called in. One afternoon, Lacey comes home late to find Mr. Cephas waiting for her. After explaining why she's late, remember she's tutoring Anjanee after school, her father replies, "So you're playing woman now? You could just go where you want, when you want. And out of all the children it have in that big school, the only thing you could find friend with is a coolie." Here we again see the theme of racial segregation. Mr. Cephas calls Anjanee a coolie because she's of Indian ethnicity. This is in a sense similar to Prosar's uncle calling black people niggers back in chapter 20. The adults teach the children to be racist, to treat those of another race with disdain. We'll discuss this further when we get to themes. Mr. Cephas continues to rant and rave and lecture Lacey. We can see that he has become more comfortable with lashing out at her and putting her in her place. No more after-school lessons, Lacey narrates. But even so, she's becoming even more comfortable with taking risks and getting into trouble at school. Instead of teaching Anjanee after school, she will now cut classes to do so. Anjanee, though she plays along, is less relaxed about the whole situation. Lacey continues to try with Anjanee, but the work is at times too difficult for her. Anjanee is simply too far behind. Once, Lacey gets a bit too harsh with Anjanee and says, "But everybody learned this for common entrance, man. And you said common entrance twice. How you don't get it yet? Try, na man, try." This brings Anjanee to tears and ruins the whole day. The passive-aggressive war between Lacey and Mr. Cephas continues. At home, Lacey gives him the cold shoulder, and at school, she deliberately messes around so not to score any marks he can be happy about. Mr. Cephas continues to growl at Miss Velma and shout at Michael, but Lacey does not give him any concrete reasons to argue with her. She's in a tough position, towing a delicate line. She wants him to get upset enough to send her home, but she also seems too afraid to outrightly disrespect him. After all, she sees what he does to Michael. Lacey makes up her mind that after the Christmas holidays, she will not return to her father's house. but she needs some kind of plan to make that a reality. Thinking of how upset Ma would be if she were to carry a bad report home, Lacey decides to turn things around at school, going to class regularly and even being polite to the circus horse. Also, she and Anjanee study for the upcoming end-of-term exams every chance they get. Lacey's bags are packed 2 weeks before the end of the term. She's just itching to leave this place. She puts a plan in place to never return after leaving for the holidays. She will use the bus fare Ma gave her to come home and then send Uncle Leroy to pick up her belongings during the vacation. Then she would finally be free. The atmosphere at the Cephas lightens just a little bit as Christmas time rolls in. Mr. Cephas asks Lacey if she is going to spend Christmas there with them, knowing full well she has no intention of doing so. After a flat and expected no, he says that he will take her to Ma on Saturday. Lacey says she will take the bus instead, which throws her father into a fit of rage, as having her take the bus home would make it seem as if he's not a responsible father. Again, it's all about the optics, all about the image. At least he agrees to let Michael come with them. Lacey does not want to be alone in the car with her father for such a long drive. The end of term exams come and go, with Anjanee knowing she will not be getting back any good results. After that, there's an exciting class party, with Marlon Peters starring the show by doing a hilarious impression of the circus horse, costume and all. Even after the party, Lacey and Anjanee are in a very good mood. So sure is Lacey that she will not be returning to her father's house that she promises her friend after school lessons starting next term. The conversation shifts and Anjanee reveals that she has gotten her monthly and is therefore a woman now. Lacey feels left behind, having not yet reached said milestone herself. Anyhow, the two reflect nostalgically on how they first became friends when they were paired together on the first day of school. In one sense, this may feel like a friendship formed by pure luck, but in another sense, it may feel like destiny. Finally, Lacey opens her report and, as expected, it gleams with commendations from her teachers. When Mr. Cephas sees this stellar report, he wants to keep it to show his boss on Monday morning, but as it is addressed to Ma, he does not have that right. The wording of these last lines indicate that Lacey belongs not with her father, but with Ma and the rest of the family back home. The lines also indicate that while she lives with her father, it is Ma who ultimately has charge over her. Orville unexcitedly drops Lacey off at Ma's house. Having gotten used to a more pristine, upscale living environment, Ma's house appears cramped and primitive to Lacey. We see this through the descriptive language that stretches from page 136 to 137. This again highlights the difference between the rural and urban, between country and town. Similarly, as she has gotten used to a life where less physical and menial work is demanded of her, she can no longer manage carrying 2 buckets of water, a task that was once easy for her. Carlisle, Lacey's cousin, has had to pick up the slack since Lacey has been away. While down in the garden with Uncle Leroy, Lacey announces that she will not be going back to her father's house. But telling Uncle Leroy is pointless. It is Ma she needs to talk to about that. Anyhow, Uncle Leroy replies, "You want to come back here and eat green fig?" Even to the point of frustration, he reminds her that moving back here would mean living a harder life and having a much harder time getting to and from school. In the coming days, the Christmas work begins. The whole family is excited to partake in this seasonal overhaul. There's extensive cleaning and decorating. In the midst of all this, Lacey brings up the topic of not returning to her father's house. "He is your father. He is working for money. Let him mind you," Ma replies. Then, when Lacey insists, Ma tells her to talk to Papi about it. The Christmas cleaning and decorations continue as the extended family works together to transform the whole place. Uncle Leroy even paints the front steps, transforming it into a royal carpet of red, scraping out the paint tint to get the job done. Then he jokes, when Lacey passes her high school exam and gets her big work, she will buy a paint to do the whole house. It is usual for Uncle Leroy to express his faith and pride in Lacey through jokes like these. We see that even Mama Patsy is in on the action, having sent down new curtains from America. The entire family is swimming in a spirit of elation and merriment. So much so that, according to page 144, it is impossible to anger Ma. We see that Mama Patsy has sent not just a curtain, but a whole barrel. It was and still is a regular practice for Caribbean people who have moved abroad to send barrels home at Christmas time. Not just the house, but even the children are cleaned inside and out, flushed out with worm oil. Their screaming and squirming cannot stop Uncle Leroy from getting the slimy medicine down their throats. Ma goes to La Puerta to visit Ma Zeline and buy some things. She will also pick up Leroy's daughter, Charlene, who is living or staying with her grandmother, Maharajin. Maharajan calls Charlene a Kilwal child, meaning half black, half Indian. This term is used in the same derogatory sense as coolie. Maharajan apparently disapproved of her daughter making Creole child with Leroy. More on this when we look at race in the upcoming section of the course. Ma returns from La Porta at 4 o'clock. She comes back with Uncle Leroy's little daughter Charlene, as well as a bag of Christmas stuff. She talks about her visit with Ma Zeline and how she is sick but is defying the doctors, overworking herself in the garden. She's a hardened old lady. She intends to dead standing up, Ma says about her. She then half-jokingly says to Lacey, "You mightn't find no Ma Zeline when I go back to La Puerta." But the thought of going back to La Puerta, and worse with no Ma Zeline, is depressing for Lacey. The day before Christmas Eve comes, with the arrival of more family and much more Christmas preparation. Christmas Eve comes with more Christmas activities and even more merriment. For now, Lacey can enjoy the Christmas festivities with her family and forget about her father and his depressing house. After Christmas, the reality of La Puerta and all therein returns to Lacey's mind, and the conversation of not returning there continues. "So you want to live at home?" Ma asks Lacey. "Yes, Ma," Lacey answers. Ma then talks about Mama Patsy and how she never got the chance to reach her dream of being a dentist, and how Uncle Leroy, though bright, never had the chance of being an aeroplane mechanic. That is because they did not make it past primary school. Now, since Mr. Cephas is taking care of Lacey, Mama Patsy can finally focus on going back to school to finally chase her own dreams. Ma guilts Lacey by telling her that only by staying at her father's house will Mama Patsy get the chance to finish high school. Mr. Cephas arrives to pick up Lacey, prim and punctual. Ma, after inviting him in, tells him reproachfully that it is natural for Lacey to want to see her family, and informs him that she has given Lacey fear to come home for carnival. Mr. Cephas seems completely fine with this, and when Ma asks about Lacey's behavior, he has nothing bad to report. "Well, I hope she ain't looking no thinner next time I see her," Ma says, making it clear to Mr. Cephas that he better take care of Lacey. Now it is Pappy's turn. He speaks like a reproving preacher and a philosophical poet. Listen to what he says. "Well, you be sure to give due care and attention to our child, you understand? If any harm befall this child of ours, you shall answer for it. You have much to atone for." To which Mr. Cephas replies, "I know, sir." Then Pappy says, "Fulfill your atonement with honor. Go in peace." And as big and bad as Mr. Cephas is in his own house, he must bow humbly and show utmost respect to Ma and Pappy, who consider Lacey to be their own child. But we know that deep down inside, Cephas is burning with indignation. Mr. Cephas quickly takes his leave, gripping the steering wheel furiously. Then he starts to lecture Lacey about how ungrateful she is. And only now, when he is out of Ma and Pa's presence, he has the nerve to disrespect them, calling them backward people with no ambition. He goes on to talk about how disrespectful Lacey is and how it is her mother and grandmother who are teaching her to disrespect him. Then his own insecurity spills out when he says, "You think because you have a little more schooling than me, that I is nobody and you could disrespect me?" And he continues, while Lacey bears the long, uncomfortable journey back to her father's house. This car ride back to Mr. Cephas's house somewhat parallels that first car ride that opens the novel. Lacey reaches Mr. Cephas's house to find a half-pleading, half-reproachful Miss Velma. In contrast to her, the house seems to have undergone a great deal of decoration for Christmas. Miss Velma tells Lacey that their Christmas time was not so nice. Mr. Cephas was upset because Lacey had chosen to go back to Ma for Christmas, and so a glumness swallowed the whole house. One of Mr. Cephas's main problems is that Lacey's return to Ma for the holidays reveals to people that he's not really in charge of his own daughter. His lack of ultimate power and control over Lacey is what he finds so offensive. Michael is glad to see Lacey, but seeing her reminds him that he should go and bathe. This reinforces the impact Lacey has had on him and the respect he has for her. "That is who miss you the most," Miss Velma says in reference to Michael. We get a grim reminder of how disappointed Mr. Cephas is in Michael. Miss Velma even says that he wanted to give the boy away. It becomes apparent on page 162 that Lacey is, in a way, a replacement for Michael, the one that will be able to achieve the greatness that Mr. Cephas had once aspired for the boy. Miss Velma says, "He wants you to go to university and study to be a doctor or a lawyer. That is the hopes he had for Michael, but he gave up on him." School resumes and there is no sign of Anjanee, much to Lacey's anxiousness and restlessness. Even the next day, Anjanee is still absent. Lacey is unable to concentrate in class. and instead thinks of how she would like to see her father dead. She imagines different ways in which he might die, but she's brightened up by the thought of the approaching carnival, when she would get to go home again. But her mind again goes back to the torture of living with her father for the rest of her days at school. By day 3, still no Anjanee in sight, Lacey starts sitting with the notorious Doreen Sandiford and her gang of loafers. She eats lunch with them for the rest of the week. Lacey's defiance of the circus horse had gained their respect. After missing the whole week, Anjanee resurfaces on Monday, her face thin and pale. She explains to Lacey that after taking the sick baby to the clinic, she learned that she herself was sick with anemia. But that isn't all. Anjanee had been selling in the market every day throughout the holiday to send herself to school. Whatever little support her family once showed her is now gone, obviously. When Lacey complains about being stuck in her father's house, Anjanee, who is quite used to making sacrifices to help her own mother, encourages Lacey to endure the discomfort so that Mama Patsy can finish school as well. Things go downhill fast with Anjanee. As days pass, she looks sicker and is absent more often, and therefore falls further behind in her studies. This is all because she has been made into what could be described as a child slave. Her brothers and father do none of the housework, and she helps her mother with everything. And the work is so exhausting that it makes coming to school next to impossible. At this point, she has lost all hope for a productive and independent future, resigning to the reality that she will drop out of school and become the same as her mother. Lacey offers to cut classes to help Anjanee catch up, but Anjanee begs Lacey not to do anything to get herself into trouble. Anjanee knows that she herself is hopeless, and so she wants Lacey to succeed for them both. As more days pass, Lacey does everything she can to reach home late in the evenings, until one day Miss Velma asks, "What you will say to your father when he catch you out in the road this hour?" Mr. Cephas says to Lacey one day, "Your old man still betting on you to come first in the test, you know. Don't let down me and your Auntie V." As Anjanee grows more absent, Lacey spends more and more time with Doreen and the gang, now skipping classes and roaming to school with them. She falls behind in her schoolwork and begins having trouble with her assignments. For some classes, she doesn't do homework at all. All this is to spite her father, who is looking forward to a stellar report from her. But then she realizes that right after the midterm, she will be going home for carnival, which means Ma would see her report as well. She decides to waste time with Doreen and the others for 1 or 2 more weeks, and then get back to studying properly. But in that time, she ends up committing the most serious school crime with this gang, going to the plaza during school hours. Lacey, along with Doreen and the others, have broken out of school and are at the plaza. They hear a carnival song that perfectly depicts the track Lacey is on, as she shifts from being a studious A student to breaking the rules and getting low marks. They have such a grand time that they don't notice Mr. Tewari until he shouts at them. They make themselves scarce. But even after that scare, Lacey and a few others linger by, while Doreen and 2 others head straight back to the plaza for chicken and chips. They make it back to school before roll call, and they seem to have gotten away with it. Lacey, after such a close call, now vows no more playing the fool. While she wants to spite her father, she would hate to bring home a bad report to Ma and the others. It turns out that the deviants did not escape after all. The next morning, they are instructed by Miss Hafiz to head to the conference room. They would all be suspended for a week. They will collect a letter to take home and then return with a parent or guardian, and then go back home to serve the suspension. Lacey's letter is addressed to Ma, but she cannot imagine involving Ma in all this and bringing such shame down on her. How upsetting and disappointing would that be? Lacey decides that it is best to get Miss Velma involved, as she might be too afraid to tell Mr. Cephas. This would also ensure that Ma and the others back home would not learn of this. Miss Velma falls into a panic when she reads the suspension letter. "Child, why you bring this trouble on people? What going to happen when a father come home? Lord Jesus, deliver us," she wails. She decides, upon Lacey's request, to go to the school instead of Mr. Cephas. Miss Velma goes to the school and gets the suspension letter signed. At home, in cahoots with Lacey, she keeps this a secret from Mr. Cephas. She's anxious and jumpy. If Mr. Cephas ever finds out about this, it will be big trouble for both of them. By day 3, Mr. Cephas storms into the house in a fit of rage. He lashes out at them, gravely offended to have been kept in the dark about this. He has found out about this from a co-worker. In the midst of Mr. Cephas' rage, Miss Velma takes a brave step and tells him that bringing Lacey here was a bad idea and that he should take her back to Ma. This further angers Mr. Cephas. How dare this woman tell him what to do? None of you will give me orders. I is the man in this house. I is the man. I is the man, he declares. A little while later, he says that Ma should be the one to go and take the shame, while Mr. Cephas should gloat in his daughter's glory. It is Ma who should show up now in this time of shame. Miss Velma later tells Lacey that she has caused enough trouble and should go back home. Lacey, she says, is turning her father into a worse beast than he was to begin with. When Lacey returns to school, Anjanee reproachfully expresses grave disappointment in her. Lacey, you don't care nothing, Anjanee scolds. And then Lacey reflects. She was struggling so hard to come to school, and I was throwing it all away. Even though in the beginning, Lacey was an A student while Anjanee was the absentee, always playing catch-up, now Anjanee is the one lecturing Lacey about taking school more seriously. Furthermore, Lacey, with the suspension, has now missed even more classes than Anjanee. One after the other, the midterm tests come around, and Lacey is too behind to answer the questions well. She worries about how she would disappoint Ma and the others. Even Uncle Leroy would be angry with her for playing the jackass with school. Unable to bear disappointing her family like this, she decides to stay at her father's for carnival. How ironic that the plan made with the intention of spiting and escaping her father is what ends up trapping her there and keeping her away from Ma and the others. Lacey is too despondent to make merry in the carnival festivities, and instead stays in her room while everyone else is out celebrating. Everyone but Miss Velma anyway. We continue to see how the tables have turned between Lacey and Anjanee, with Anjanee now being the one worried about Lacey. On mornings, Anjanee would ask Lacey, Lacey, you do the homework? Anjanee wants to make sure that Lacey does not waste her chance to secure a proper education, especially since she knows that she herself will likely not get the chance to finish school. But the worry and concern were mutual, with Lacey realizing that Anjanee looks very unwell, and that her clothes are worn and discolored. Lacey narrates, it was as if she was fading away, which does well to foreshadow what is to come. One day Anjanee laments, the doctor say I have to rest too. But how will I rest? I have to help my mother, and I want to come to school. I want to come to school and pass my exam. Distressing as this is, it only gets worse for Anjanee. One Monday, she faints in General Assembly. Anjanee has hit a physical breaking point. Again, this foreshadows what is to come, particularly with the language used in the narration, as the teacher is said to have hurried away with her dangling body. 3 days pass and Anjanee is yet to reappear at school. Lacey, on Friday, wakes up with such a heavy feeling that she cannot move, and a weight like lead presses down on her. She also feels a tight knot in her belly. What could all this mean? Well, look at the dream she had the night before. She had a strange dream involving the circus horse, Mama Patsy, and Miss Velma. But the dream somehow ends with Marceline falling dead in the garden. Lacey cannot shake the ominousness that this dream seems to bring. And as readers, we can sense that the foreshadowing will soon culminate into something tragic. Lacey cannot concentrate in class. She's all too worried about Anjanee, who has now been absent for a week straight. Lacey even wonders if Anjanee has given up on school. In math class, the circus horse calls Lacey while she's lost in thought, insulting her. But worse, also insulting Anjanee. This triggers Lacey, who claps back at the circus horse without restraint. Your mother must be the dog, Lacey belts out to the teacher in the middle of class. Even Lacey herself is stunned that such words have come out of her mouth. Again, and with a stomach ache in the mix, Lacey is waiting outside the principal's office. Another suspension, it seems. She again despairs about how disappointing this would be to Ma. Lacey then finds that there's a big commotion going on in the school. At first, Lacey wonders if her outburst had shaken the school, but she soon realizes that none of this is about her. Lacey, one girl exclaims, you ain't hear what happened? Anjanee drink poison. And in that moment, Lacey knows that the dream, the knot in her stomach, the heavy feeling, all of it led up to this moment. And for us readers, we finally see what all this ominous foreshadowing was pointing to. Lacey's bellyache worsens. She says her insides have turned to liquid. She's feeling the bellyache on top of the weight of the shocking news that she has just received. She blames herself for Anjanee's suicide. She must have done it because I let her down. Lacey heads home, and Miss Velma isn't surprised to see her. as she had heard the news about Anjanee. But what a thing, eh? These Indian girls so quick to take poison. You didn't know the girl, you know her? Miss Velma asks. Lacey denies knowing her. Miss Velma seems excited about the news and shows no sympathy for Anjanee. Also, see how she just assumes that Anjanee drank poison willy-nilly. But Lacey, as well as the readers, knows about the unbearable burden that this poor Indian girl was carrying. The attention turns back to the bellyache. Tell me what it is. You turn a young lady? Miss Velma inquires. But Lacey's mind is stayed on Anjanee. She tries to convince herself that Anjanee isn't dead, but she somehow knows that there will be no more Anjanee. Like a ghost, Anjanee's voice haunts Lacey. Lacey, you don't care nothing? And this bears on Lacey's head even while she thinks about how heartbroken Ma and the others will be when they find out that she has been playing the jackass. The pressure wells up in Lacey's head and she seemingly suffers a nervous breakdown. We get a time skip to the Easter holidays when Lacey is back at Ma's place. She has spent weeks indoors after having been to the hospital. She had spent weeks confined to her bed. Clearly, the breakdown she had was quite serious and had long-lasting effects on her physically and mentally. Lacey is depressed and spends her days staring up at the ceiling. We're not sure how Ma and the others reacted to Lacey's misbehavior and poor performance at school, but perhaps none of that mattered in the face of this extreme trial of dealing with the loss of her best friend and the subsequent nervous breakdown. Her family rallies around her, patiently encouraging and comforting her, doing their best to nurse her back to her old self. For the first time since being home from the hospital, Lacey gets out of bed and walks, much to the excitement of the family. Ma leads her to a chair and calls out loudly, "Leroy, Leroy, come quick, Leroy!" And the family converges upon her in support. In this final chapter, we see that Lacey's life brightens a little. She seems to have crawled out of the depressive state. She opens the chapter by saying, "I was glad to be in the world again." She engages with the family more and takes part in more and more activities, getting her groove back, so to speak. She gets back to doing chores, and her mood has drastically improved since the days of lying in bed staring up at the ceiling. We also see that this whole ordeal has changed and matured her. She upgrades from her dolly garden to a real garden, indicating that she's now doing serious farming, actually contributing to her family while helping to support herself. Uncle Leroy says, "You have to make garden to eat now, girl, because you're not getting Mr. Cephas grocery food again." While her father would continue to buy school books and uniforms for her, he would no longer feed her or give her money for taxi fare. While Lacey was sick, Papa and others met with Mr. Cephas to tell him that while Lacey would not be living with him anymore, he would still need to financially support her through school. Uncle Leroy makes Lacey laugh with his hilarious impression of Papi in that meeting. This laughter really indicates that she's in a much more positive place than she was some time ago. While Lacey gets to stay with her family again, as she has been hoping for, this will make getting to school much harder for her. She will have to get up very early in the mornings to make the journey to school. But Lacey doesn't seem to mind. She says Anjanee used to have to wake up 4 o'clock in the morning to go to school. She is prepared to do whatever it takes to make it through school, knowing that Anjanee had it way worse and still did her best. Besides, Lacey knows that she is pursuing an education, not just for herself, but also for Anjanee. And so she will not waste her chance. The table turning of Lacey and Anjanee comes full circle, as Lacey feels like she is taking up Anjanee's life. Like Anjanee had to, she will now have to wake up early to go to school. Also, like Anjanee had to, Lacey must now do a lot of work to help make ends meet, such as selling things with Ma and Carlisle during the week. But all of this hard work, we know, is a price that Lacey is willing to pay to live amongst the people who really love and care for her, and to escape the depressing and toxic household of the Cephases. On the weekend before Lacey goes back to school, Ma and Uncle Leroy prepare for a massive Thanksgiving celebration, which will be held the Saturday after the reopening of school. This is symbolic of Lacey's thankfulness to be home again, despite the accompanying hardship, and of her family's thankfulness for having her back home. And that is it for our summary and analysis of the plot. Jump over to the next video where we'll take a deeper look at the characters.